This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the easiest, fastest, and most secure way to swap your digital assets. Don't run the risk of leaving your funds on a centralized exchange. Visit Shapeshift.io to get started today. Hello everybody. In today's episode, we interviewed Trent McConaghy from Ocean Protocol and BigChainDB. And just as a quick note, today's episode is a little bit longer than normal. It's an hour and a 15-minute interview. And this is kind of a thing that I'm going to do more of in 2018, which are these longer interviews in kind of a bimodal system, where more like 20-minute interviews and also more like 2-hour interviews. So this is an experiment with that. In today's interview, it's kind of broken into two parts. The first is all about cryptoeconomic primitives, and the second is all about kind of societal stuff. And so if you want to societal stuff, so if you feel free to listen to either or if you want to. Okay, so with that, yeah, a couple things, like an overview of what Trent and I talked about. We talked a lot about cryptoeconomic primitives today, and Ocean Protocol uses two of them. They use curation markets and token-curated registries, and they use the curation markets essentially as a way to signal towards good data, where you say, hey, I think this data is going to be awesome, so I'm going to stake towards it, and then when a bunch of people use that data, you essentially get more rewards because you staked to it, and you get more money for staking earlier. So it uses curation markets, and it also uses token-curated registries, and it uses those because they create log rewards on data sets. And what I mean by that is they don't want too much centralization, and so if you have a bunch of people getting stuff from a single data set, then that'd be pretty centralized. But the reward function is, it goes through a log function, so it says, hey, if you get a bunch of this stuff, we're actually going to push through a log function, so you get the log of that rather than the big number. So instead of 100, it'll be 10. So because of that, they need to have a token-curated registry on the agents in the system, where you say, hey, there can't be Reese 1 and also Reese 12. You essentially have a whitelist for those different agents that are acting there. So that is how they use it, and a couple notes on it. First, I always like to ask myself, should you be using a curation market or should you be using a token-curated registry? And in this example, it's perfect because it's well, what would happen if they flipped? Could you have a token-curated registry or a TCR for the data, and could you have a curation market for the agents in the system? And I think you could here. You can imagine a TCR that says, hey, this is an awesome data list, and people want to get in on that awesome data list. And you can also imagine a curation market for the actors in the space and the agents, and saying, hey, these people have various stakes toward them to show that they're good actors or whatever. That's possible. Whenever you're thinking about this, and in general, I trust Ocean Protocol for whatever they did, think about, essentially, are you trying to make a binary or a gradient? Something like a TCR is really good at making a binary, whether you're in the list or you're out, and something like a curation market's much better at a gradient, where you're just signaling. And that's the other key thing here is, are you trying to make sets of things or lists of things? If so, then use a TCR, or are you just trying to kind of signal to things? If you're trying to signal, then probably use curation markets. So that's one side of things, is what happens when you flip the two. And always, when you're doing this yourself, ask yourself, TCR, curation market, which one should I use? And the second thing that I want to say here is kind of doing some weird abstraction of these cryptoeconomic systems. So Ocean Protocol has its proof of X layer, and they're essentially proving that you are proof of giving people data, and then they also have the data reputation layer, where you have the curation markets around for which data is good, and then they also have the agent reputation layer, which is the token-curated registries around that. And I think that those three buckets actually kind of hold in many different cryptoeconomic systems, where you have your proof of X layer, which is your utility value layer, where you're trading some scarce resource or capital for tokens in the system. And then you have these kind of reputation layers there, the data reputation layer, and then also essentially the subjects of the system and what data you're looking at, and then the agent reputation layer, which are the objects that are operating on that system. So I think that's an okay abstraction to use here. Or another way to think about it is, you have the proof of X, where you're essentially proving that you've done something in the past, while the curation side is showing that you think about the future. So this is where you use all these cryptoeconomic primitives, whether it's TCRs, curation markets, prediction markets, whatever, where you're saying, hey, I think I'm going to stake some stuff now because I think in the future something will happen and I'll get more money back as a result. The other final way to think about these from this abstracted way is as kind of there's not only curating based off of the objects where you're saying, I think this is good or I think that's good, but there's also curation as a result of kind of reputations. So people that have done good things get reputation as objects going forward. So yeah, I think that abstraction is a fine way to think about these cryptoeconomic systems in general. And then the final thing I want to say here is we talked today about a lot about staking here, and this is just a big thing that people are talking about in the space these days, both with proof of stake algorithms at the protocol level, but also at the application layer, because staking essentially allows you to decrease your token velocity, which increases its value. So people are thinking a lot about staking these days, and that's part of this kind of emerging buckets for how to use your tokens. There's the proof of X side where you get the tokens for doing the utility. There's the staking side, there's also the governance side, and then finally the medium of exchange side. And then the other thing I want to highlight here is about this log rewards function that Trent was talking about. So this I think is actually really powerful. He was talking about in the context of data providers and not trying to make too much centralization. So if you are really, really good and you do all your stuff and you should get a ton of money for it or whatever, actually you get the log of that. And I think this is actually pretty similar, but from like a societal perspective, the things I'm trying to do around these memes and pledges and commitments to decentralized power. So for me, after $45,000, when you don't get happier, when you get more money, I give 50% of the money that I make back to the system, and essentially giving it to charities or whatever. And I think that's one way to think about it. I'm essentially doing like demurrage on myself, kind of like water cycle evaporation, where I'm evaporating the money that I get back to the system, instead of like our current, capitalist systems where the money, essentially money compounds instead of getting demurraged. But I think that a log reward function is another really good similar way to say this, where you say, hey, people should get a good amount of money at the beginning, but then as that keeps increasing, they probably don't need all the massive amount of money or whatever. So giving log reward functions, I think, is another powerful way to think about this. And the third thing is that later when we talk, in the second half of the episode, we talk a lot about tokenizing the enterprise and the map. And tokenizing the enterprise is this really great concept where you essentially take a company, you convert all the equity in that company to tokens, and then you backfill those tokens for engagement. So if you're a really engaged Facebook user, you get a lot of Facebook tokens, and then you essentially give those tokens utility with things like distributed governance. And I think that this could be really awesome in the future because it could provide transparency and aligned incentives. And we're just at the beginning of seeing some of these experiments. We're like Kick and Ken, Props and You now, Numerai and Numeraire. And I really hope that those initial experiments show that we can create transparency and aligned incentives around these things, because if so, then we might see SoundCloud tokenize themselves, and then we get to things that could be really good for society, like Twitter and Facebook tokenizing themselves. So that's one side of things. The other side is we talk about this map idea that Trent has, which is essentially a series of steps that we need to take as society in order to kind of self-actualize as a whole society. And this is a great idea, and you can imagine it's like those steps as like places where money can be put to solve a given problem for a given impact. And that's super, super aligned with the stuff I'm doing around co-evolving the phase shift to crypto capitalism by founding the Ethereum Commons Co-op, which is some of the other work that I do. And the key concept on both of them is essentially this kind of self-tithing, demurrage thing, and then sending that money and pointing that money at various buckets. So what Trent thinks of as the map, and as nodes in that map, you can also think of as buckets, or as like Giveth calls them, these decentralized autonomous communities, or in Stake Tree, it's an individual like pages or whatever. And I'm really excited I'm starting to MVP these buckets on Stake Tree. I'm excited to then federate with, Giveth on this, and really start to see, hey, can we create these awesome buckets that a lot of people can point their money towards that then gets maximized for impact in terms of this big map that we're trying to build. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the interview today with Trent. And finally, before I begin, here are two quick things that I'm leading that you might be interested in. The first is I'm co-leading the ETH Denver Hackathon, which is the next in the series of ETH Global Hackathons. We're really working with the ETH Waterloo team. We expect 500 hackers, awesome speakers like Joe Lubin, William O'Gayar, Linda Xia. We have these awesome workshops, both on the coding side, things like cryptoeconomic primitives, bonding and staking, etc. And then also some great non-coding workshops, which are emphasizing as well, things like governance, complex system dynamics. So if you're interested, it's February 16th through 18th, and you can go and learn more at ethdenver.com. And then the second thing that I'm doing that you might be interested in is what's called the Ethereum Commons Co-op. And this is a new project that I'm starting that essentially allows for more cross-project co-evolution and kind of facilitates that, and then also tells the story about this new future that we want to live in that internalizes externalities. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to my Twitter. Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark, and you're listening to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future. And in this podcast, we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world, where we have a couple different series that focus on different system scopes. And today we're kind of focusing on two different of these scopes. One is the Series A macro systems, where we'll be thinking about humanity and where we're headed, the philosophical, technological future. And then second, we're going to also talk about software systems and cryptoeconomics and kind of what machine systems exist in code. And to talk about both these things, I'm very happy to introduce Trent McConaghy to the show. Trent works at the intersection of AI plus blockchain and is the CTO of BigchainDB and Ocean Protocol. Trent, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Hi there, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excited to chat. So I guess let's actually start more on the software system side. And Trent, could you guys just give us an overall view on the things that you're doing all around data with both Ocean and BigchainDB?
Sure. So I'll start with BigchainDB and then lead it into Ocean. BigchainDB has been out for about a couple of years now, actually, and it's a blockchain database. And what that means is it has characteristics of a database where you have querying and not only like querying type language and so on, but also fast querying, and then bringing in blockchain characteristics of decentralized, immutable, and assets, creating assets, issuing assets. And so it's sort of a way to combine the benefits of both of those. So it's meant to be complementary in the stack, the decentralized stack, to things like file systems like Filecoin and processing component like Ethereum. So just like in the traditional LAMP stack or other compute stacks, we see that there's a decentralized stack for a decentralized stack, and BigchainDB plays a role there. So that's BigchainDB, and then with Ocean, it is higher in the stack, where at the end of the day, what it's trying to do is be a substrate for data. So to make it really easy to build data marketplaces on top, whether they're centralized or decentralized. So it has an incentive mechanism to have a high quality supply of data. So it's all about maximizing the supply of high quality data. And that's not only for price data within a data marketplace framework, but also the data commons. So basically people who are submitting data and referring data can actually get compensated for it, sort of resolving this classic question of data wants to be free, it also wants to be expensive. So there's kind of a new answer to that. And so it's really this data substrate to help power data marketplaces and a data commons. And in fact, it does generalize to a more general service layer as well. But talking about data is really good focus. And it's really tuned towards AI applications. These, AIs themselves for classification and for regression especially are insatiable in their demand for data. You improve the data by the amount of data by 10x or 100x, and you can reduce the error from 20% to 5% to 1% and more. So it can make all the difference between an infeasible AI product and a feasible one, or a feasible one and a profitable one. So that's really BigchainDB and Ocean. BigchainDB, a database for the decentralized stack, and Ocean Protocol, substrate for data marketplaces and a global data commons.
Great. So I think there's a lot to dive in there. I think that's a really good overview. I guess, so staying on the BigchainDB side for just a quick second, you're saying, so I can see how it's complementary to something like Ethereum, where you say, hey, you're using Ethereum for smart contract kind of computation. And then, saying, though, that it's like complementary to something like Filecoin, I kind of hear it as something maybe similar. I guess Filecoin is purely just a storage of blobs, while this is maybe the actual database. Is that right? Is that kind of the distinction between?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Like for an Amazon Web Services, for example, which is the centralized cloud. You've got Amazon S3 for storing blobs, and Amazon DynamoDB or say MongoDB or something for structured data, right? So the blobs, you reference it via a URL or the hash in a sense. And with the structured data, you typically find it via queries, right? Via some sort of structured query language, like classic SQL for structured query language, or the NoSQL type queries too that you find in Mongo and the like, right? So BigchainDB is like a decentralized Mongo, and in fact, we wrap MongoDB itself. So it's a very apt comparison.
Cool. So I guess one other thing to check there is, I'm imagining, and I don't know too much about these, but there are things like these, parallel processing server clusters, things like Hadoop. And feel free to correct me as I'm wrong here, but how does something like, so let's say I'm in here, I'm coding my smart contract application on Ethereum, and I'm like, okay, I'm using Filecoin to store some like images, then I'm using, why would I use, I guess, BigchainDB over something like MongoDB, over something like Hadoop to store to have my database?
Yeah, so overall, the question is, where do you want to have the sovereignty of the data, right? Do you want your users to control it, but maybe have it stored in a decentralized way, or do you want it to be sitting on, some centralized company like Amazon or some other service provider, right? And the answer is the same reason you're using Ethereum rather than EC2, or the same reason you're using Filecoin instead of S3, right? It's because you get these different benefits for decentralization. The main one, when it comes to sort of personal use, is about regaining the sovereignty of your own personal data, right? Yet still being able to use that personal data within the context of various web services, social networks, et cetera, right? There are other uses too. So overall, when you think about it, let's say for your application, you're going to store the data. Things like, let's say you've got a music service, right? Maybe the songs themselves and the images for albums might be stored in, say, Filecoin, and the business logic-y stuff would be in Ethereum. But then the lists of the metadata, the IP rights licensing, all of this, the massive libraries of hundreds of millions of songs, that's all in BigchainDB. And in the case of BigChain, it is designed to be very efficient, and so you can store a lot more data on BigChain than Ethereum, which is not really designed for massive amounts of storage, right? And it doesn't really have any querying out of the box, whereas that's the whole point of BigChain. It's a difference between a database and processing, right? Like these are different pieces of the stack, right?
Yep.
It's very simple that way.
Cool. Yeah, so that makes sense. And as you say, yeah, like the key thing for why you'd want to use is, instead of using something like Mongo, you can instead have the users regain sovereignty over their data, but still use it within these applications. So that makes sense. I guess then kind of transitioning over to Ocean. So it sounds like, Ocean is, and you use this word substrate, and I'd like to dive into that word for a bit more, because I think it's a very powerful word, but not as many people use it. Is substrate, similar to protocol, where it's like this protocol for these new data marketplaces, kind of a substrate for these new data marketplaces, or how do you use the term substrate there?
Yeah, so Ocean is a protocol, but protocol isn't that descriptive as well, right? Because sort of every new building block in this emerging decentralized stack is a protocol, right? Just like if you say it's SAS, well, SAS doesn't tell you that much, right? Because you have these different building blocks, right? Or library in traditional compute stacks. So it is a protocol in that there's a clearly defined set of behaviors expected from it. How the computers talk to each other and so on. But then beyond, it's a substrate in the sense of things build on top of it. But maybe I'll start with an analogy. So I assume you've bought airline tickets online, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And you might use, say, Kayak, or maybe Hitmonk, or
some aggregator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or it could be maybe you go to AmericanAirlines.com or something too. So, but if you ever go to Kayak, you do a search for, say, flying to Berlin, because everyone wants to come to Berlin, of course, and you'll get a bunch of results, and then let's say you go to Hitmonk, and you'll get very similar results. The same flights, maybe slightly different orders. And why is that? And the answer is that they're all actually accessing the same database below, right? And it's a database that called Sabre / Amadeus that's been around for a couple decades actually. And so that database was initially started in the late 80s, actually, by one airline, and then it kind of grew in usage and kind of took over the industry. But now, basically, we have this common data substrate for airline data. So any one of these aggregators, they just plug into this database, whether it's Expedia, Travelocity, Kayak, whatever, or even the individual airlines, right? And, the price offers are there, et cetera, et cetera. And then we actually see a lot of innovation on the UX level and other ways of bundling things, et cetera, right? So that's sort of, and that's been really great, right? It's very good for the consumer. We have all this variety of UX, et cetera. Compare that to the world of data, where, let's say you want to buy data, you can go to various data marketplaces right now. They're mostly centralized, but they only have a small amount of data that's limited in scope, et cetera. Like you go to Bloomberg for your feed related to the stocks and stuff, and other places you might have to go to buy weather data and stuff, right? But what if there was some universal saber for data itself, right? Not just airline flights that are available, but a huge broad swath of data, right? And that data isn't residing there. It's basically the listings. Just like the flights themselves don't reside on Sabre, it's the pointers to buying the flights that connect you through, right? So Ocean is basically about maintaining the listings of all the different data that is available, pointing to where the data might be stored, whether it's centralized or decentralized, or even behind a firewall. And it's basically giving this vast supply of data that then centralized and decentralized marketplaces can be selling on top, right?
Got it. Yeah. So
and of course the commons too. So once again, it's really, really important to balance the for sale data with the commons data. So anyway, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So let's dive into that in a second. I guess I want to check in on this term substrate. That makes sense that it's kind of and I guess just to more differentiate between substrate and protocol, that substrate is kind of this. I guess it's this. I guess, are there things that aren't data substrates? Is there another example of a substrate?
Well, to me, I mean, substrate isn't maybe a very technical term, but it kind of gives this idea that there's something a bit more meaty there, rather than, but honestly, it's just another word, right? Protocols, they can be thinner or fatter, right? So maybe substrate is just another word for a fat protocol, right? But another way to think about it too, though, is that sometimes we call Ocean a data economy, right? Because it's a collection of marketplaces. It's got this overall incentive for where these different marketplaces can hook in for data and for other resources too, like compute, et cetera, but really focusing on the data to start. So, rather than just a single marketplace, which of course can't be an economy on its own, right? You really need to have this collection of them
together. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I just wanted to dive in on that word substrate because I think it's a powerful one. I think you're right. It's maybe just similar to something like a fat protocol. Okay, so you have, I guess one other question here is, before going deeper into Ocean, is do Ocean and BigChainDB, how do they interact with each other?
Yeah, so overall, it's one company, of course, that is building right now, BigChainDB GmbH out of Germany. And actually for Ocean, we are partnering with a company out of Singapore called DEX, and they have traditionally been a centralized data exchange. And they found issues with the centralized part, things like people looking to sell data were hesitant to give up control of their data to a centralized marketplace. So DEX saw the writing on the wall that they wanted to go towards being a decentralized marketplace. So we joined forces with them and are rolling out, not just this sort of raw substrate, but one of the things we're building together is actually a reference marketplace design. So that way other people can come along and copy and paste it and let, 100 or 10,000 marketplace flowers bloom, right?
So it sounds like kind of like an ERC standard, but for data marketplaces. Is that right?
A little bit, yeah, but it's a lot more about the implementation and stuff too, right? So it's, ERC is a very simple protocol with just a few, functions that you have to implement. Whereas here, it's sort of like, there's a front end UX with an API and so on. And from the API perspective of marketplace for the price stuff, and then one level below, the API for the Ocean network itself is much more just about proving that you've made the data available. And then a curation on that, and this is via curation market. So those are really kind of the two core building blocks. Once again, it's a proof, generally proof of making data available, but there will be other proofs, and then curation. So you could call the Ocean network a proofed curation market, if you will, or a curated proofs market, whatever you want. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because it combines this idea of a proof of work, or proof of something like making data available, but generally something work-y, with curation market, which is very stake-y, right? So it's kind of a novel design of combining these proofs kind of attached at the hip. But what it gives you is this very nice signal of relative qualities of data, right? So rather than Ocean deciding that this data set is high quality and this one isn't, we leverage curation markets where people can put their money where their mouth is of what they think is high quality and not.
Awesome. So let's dive into cryptoeconomic primitives and curation markets and token-curated registries, which is one of my favorite topics personally. So let's talk. So I guess tell me what is a curation market, and how does Ocean protocol use a curation market for data?
Yeah. So overall, a curation market is a means to get a sort of reputation system on data in a way that has economic interests aligned. And you can use this reputation system then as a means to, signals for people to choose whether or not to download or even buy a data set, right? So that's one way of framing it. Another way is you can think of it like a lightweight ICO of every single data set, right? So if I put a data set on there and I stake on it, say it's good, that I'm vouching for it, then others can start to invest in it too. And as others invest in it, then the price of the data set goes up. So that's a couple of ways of thinking about it, right? A reputation market with teeth based on tokens or ICOing, and another one is basically putting your money where your mouth is in terms of just betting on it. And what Ocean is trying to do is maximize the supply of curated data, and that's a proxy for high quality data because we don't decide that. The very very we had a lot of design iterations towards the token design, and the token design that we have right now, and it's not cast in stone. We're giving ourselves the flexibility to change this. Is where it's you get tokens if you have served up a data set that you have bet on when asked, and you get the more you have bet on that data set, the more tokens you get, and there's a sliding price. So if you're early in betting on this, then the price is lower than if you're late on betting it. So and that's a key thing about curation markets, right? There's this sort of function of, if I was the first person to bet on it, or I published the data myself in the first place, then to get that first fraction of tokens, it might cost me of tokens in that data set, call it data set X. So let's say you want to get 500 tokens of data set X. Then maybe I have to spend 5 Ocean tokens. But to get the next 500, I might have to spend 10 Ocean tokens. And to get to the next 500, I might have to spend 15. And by doing this, it's rewarding the people who are making the data available in the first place. And then it's rewarding the early adopters. And so that's the mechanic. Now, so that's kind of step one, right? I submit the data. I have to stake on it to say that, I have the copyrights on it as well. And then others can come in and stake on it too. And the thing is, if we want to get rewards from that, there's two mechanisms. One of them is actually serving up the data, and then it's the mining rewards. And the second way is if many, many people follow me and I want to pull out, maybe because I'm no longer interested in the value of the data set, or I just want to cash out, then I can convert my tokens for that data set back to Ocean tokens, right? So they really are sort of derivatives in the classical sense. And that's a standard, how it's standard approach to token market, to curation markets. The difference with Ocean is that the curation markets function is bound to this work proof, right? So when you are serving up the data set, making it available, your expected block reward is proportional to the amount you have staked in the data set, right? So that's really a key distinction, right? So, and what this does is that by doing this, it actually binds together various possible stakeholders in the ecosystem. You've got, the miners are the keepers on one side, the people just running the nodes. You've got people serving up data, and you've got people who are, publishing the data or referring the data. And how it binds them all together is saying you kind of have to do all of the above, right? You have to stake on the data, curation market style. Which means you've either published it or you have bet on it in a referral sense, and you also have to serve it up when you're asked. And you actually, if you don't serve it up when you're asked, then actually you're not. If you're not saying you're making it available, then you're fine. If you say you're making it available and you don't serve it up, then you would lose stake, right?
Got it.
So that's kind of the new thing, basically, is this work function tied to curation markets, and it kind of gives curation markets more teeth. right? So we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, so let me try to break that down and see if I've gotten it correctly. So yeah, so at a high level, I mean, I do like a lot of your different explanations of curation markets, whether it's the lightweight ICO on each data set or the putting your money where your mouth is and betting on it. And the goal here, as you say, is this kind of for you guys, you're essentially doing mechanism design with curation markets in order to maximize the supply of curated data, which is a proxy for high quality data. And I guess, thinking about this curation market, so it's like, okay, let's say, so I'm Reese, I have some awesome data. I'm telling you, Trent, this data is great. I put it there and I say, I'm pretty sure this data is going to be awesome. And so I'm going to stake some tokens to this data and say, hey, this is awesome data. I'm going to stake, 10 ocean tokens or whatever to this data. And then when other people kind of see this data and they're like, oh my God, this data is awesome. Like if one of our friends sees it, then he or she also can stake tokens to that data set. They'll get, for them, it'll be less because they're less in on the early adopter curve. It'll cost more for them to stake to that data set. And then once someone actually accesses that data, then I, as the person who both produced it and then the other person who is in on it, we get kind of rewards based off of our essentially where we were at in that initial like curation market curve. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, that's very close, and good job in actually capturing all of that. And the key thing is your expected rewards. You get expected rewards based on how much you staked, and given if you have to be serving it up when asked, right? Mm-hmm. So. And when I say expected rewards, it's in a very similar vein to Bitcoin. So taking a step back to how Bitcoin works, right? Bitcoin, it has an objective function, which is to maximize the security of the Bitcoin network, right? And it defines security as making it really hard to unroll the list of transactions that are on its log, right? And then it says, okay, and make it. It says sort of, and a proxy for that is. The degree of security is how much electricity is going into it, assuming everyone has the same modern ASICs, right? So in a sense, what it comes down to is in Bitcoin, people maximizing the electrons in the network, right? And this is why we're seeing more and more power usage. But interestingly, at every given block reward interval, say every 10 minutes, it doesn't say, okay, well, you're going to get your Bitcoins proportional to how much you spent, like how much electricity you put in, right? Maybe I ran my laptop and I get in, 1/100,000th of the block reward because I put in a tiny amount. No, I have a 1/100,000 chance or whatever of getting the Bitcoin, and it's a much lower probability than that. But it's just to give a feel. Yep. Instead, it's a roll of the dice, and the dice gets rolled, and there's only one winner, and that winner gets all of the block reward, right? However, the expected value of Bitcoin is for me to get, that 1/1000th or 10,000th of the reward, right? And with Bitcoin, it's interesting, right? You get the same expected value, it's just very high variance, yep. Right? But then you have the pools that emerge on top, the mining pools, that essentially reduce the variance. So if I do want to get block reward for just running my laptop, I join a mining pool and let that laptop run overnight, and maybe over time I make some money, right? And because you have this variance reduction mechanism in the pool, but that's emerged on top. Similar with Ocean. So with Ocean, it's trying to maximize the supply of curated data. That's its objective function, and how that is manifested is once again, serving up data that you've staked on, and then my probability of getting the reward is proportional to how much I have staked, basically. So every time I serve up data, it rolls the dice, compares it to the difficulty, and then decides whether or not I got data. And the difficulty in the case of Bitcoin is basically the total hash rate. The difficulty in the case of Ocean is basically the total amount staked times the servings up over the last time interval, right? Say 1 week, 2 weeks, right? So it's very, very similar to Bitcoin. And this is actually it's a big testament to Bitcoin as we've been going through the design of the Ocean protocol. And I'm sure every single person who's been designing sort of tokenized protocols has seen this. Bitcoin has so many very sneaky design choices that you don't realize at first. But when you're trying to address your own challenges, if you keep going back to Bitcoin, it's like, wow, they solved that, right? Because Bitcoin could have said, okay, we're going to compute and give everything up proportionally, right? They didn't. Instead, it was just, on this expected value, and the markets emerged on top, right? And that, of course, reduces attack vectors. It reduces complexity. It's only one winner instead of n winners. All this, right? So really, really big gains. And so we're taking a lot of these lessons from Bitcoin here, and not just Bitcoin. We're looking all around and taking whatever lessons we can, right?
Yep.
Curation markets from Simon and the Token-Curated registries from Mike and so on, right?
Yep. So I guess one thing that so that all makes sense, and I do like the analogy to Bitcoin, and yay, Satoshi.
Agreed. Team Satoshi.
Yeah, exactly. One question I have is, so I guess, is when someone tries to access this piece of data that I've provided there, and that I've essentially staked to in this curation market, are they like paying some of these ocean tokens to access the data, and then that's the money that I'm getting, or like where are these tokens coming from that I am getting from providing this data?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? And overall, remember, we weren't trying to just create a decentralized data marketplace, right? That was some of the initial aimings, in the spring of 2017. But as we went along, we saw, we really want to incentivize for a global data commons, right, where people can download data without having to pay, right? And it's like, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we crack that egg, right? How do we get people to serve up data and maybe even compensate the creators of the data, yet make it free for people to download it, right? And
wait,
it's actually
so pause for a
problem,
second
right?
there. Yeah, exactly. It's like you can't both have free data and pay the people.
Well, here's the thing, right? This is a classic problem. It goes back to Stuart Brand, the famous quote, information wants to be free, and it also wants to be expensive, right? So it wants to be free in terms of the flow of the bits, right? It's just a natural thing where bits are super cheap to flow and stuff, right? But the part about information wants to be expensive, actually information itself doesn't want to be expensive. You just want the creators to get paid, right? Like, when we created a scribe several years ago now, it was all about getting the creators compensated, right? Feeding their families for creating great art, et cetera, right? And, that mantra has continued through to this day, right? So there are many sort of echoes of a scribe in what we're doing now. And so the question is, how do you compensate the creators? Even if they're putting like amazing sort of Creative Commons style or free data out there, right? Public domain data. And there's an answer, right? Want to take a stab at it? Want to guess?
The answer is you create it out of nowhere.
That's exactly it. Magic internet money, right?
Yeah.
And this is so if you think about it, right, with blockchains, right, that's sort of the first main use case, so I'll call it blockchain 0.0 is about store of value, right?
Yep.
And then sort of blockchain 1.0 was about things like immutability and provenance and that, right? And that's where like BigChainDB itself really shines, right? It's so good at stuff like that. Whether it's provenance of data or provenance of car parts or provenance of financial audit trails, right? But blockchain 2.0 is a much broader, bigger idea. And, I kick myself for not seeing this sooner, but it's kind of this superpower. And the superpower of blockchain is that you can get people to do stuff, right? Yep. How? You give them tokens. Where do the tokens come from? You print them, right? But the thing is, this is actually no different than the general idea of money, right? Like money is just a shared belief about the value, right, of that token, right? So, so in the case of this classic paradox of information wants to be free and information wants to be expensive, well, when people are serving up data and betting on its future popularity, then they are getting compensated for it by magic internet money, right? By printing according to this mining schedule.
Yep.
And the ocean mining schedule, it follows a curve much like Bitcoin, just with a longer half-life because data. It takes longer to unlock data, basically. That's why.
So yeah. Let me pause for a second here, though, because I might want to push back into this. So this is what I say to a lot of people when they're like asking me about various cryptocurrencies. I'm like, well, there's the scarce / collectible / mimetic value, and then there's also the utility value. Ethereum can be used to run smart contract code or whatever. But it sounds like in this ecosystem, something like Ocean, the token there, the Ocean coin or whatever, is that thing is being printed as magic internet money. But then if I have a bunch of these Ocean tokens, who would then want them later? Yeah.
So this is where the marketplace is sitting on top, right? Mm-hmm. This is the first part. So marketplaces of data back and forth, they can be using the Ocean tokens themselves. As well as, and this is where the generalization of Ocean really matters. Mm-hmm. So I described so far where Ocean is the substrate, where there's a proof coming in, which is proof of making data available, right?
Yep.
But if you think about the world of data, you've got data coming in a stream or otherwise, then you often have to do some pre-processing and conditioning in various ways, and then you're probably going to store it, persist it for a while, and then it's going to get consumed. And there's various architectures for this. The whole world of big data is all about this, right? Yep. And maybe some of this stuff has to be private, maybe not, right? With things like home over encryption, et cetera, right? You can have privacy on the data itself, privacy in the compute, and so with each of these things, there are standard ways to do this in the big data world with things like Apache Spark or Apache Flink and so on, right? Or, as a consumer, you might be used to playing with things like Zapier or if this then that, right? Mm-hmm. Where you can connect one API to the next to the next. And, with Zapier or if this then that, you're paying for these different services, but all you have to do is pay Zapier, right? And they pay for the services under the hood. So you pay Zapier, and then they worry about, paying off the cost one level below, right? And it's similar in the conception of Ocean. So in Ocean, basically, you've got the Ocean token to pay for these various services, whether it's buying data itself via the data marketplaces, or it's buying compute and passing off to these various, centralized or decentralized compute services. And same thing with, data cleaning or any of the rest, right? Some of the privacy preserving stuff. So that's kind of a more generalized conception of it. But at the summary of this, then, Ocean is a curated proofs network. First and foremost, it's a proof of making data available, but it's also proofs of computation, proofs of storage, proofs of space-time style storage, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. And with each of those, to your question, Ocean tokens are the means of paying for that in a sort of like one place to fit it all, right? So, you can view Ocean as an Apache Spark for the decentralized world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So and I guess that, if the more direct version of my question there was like, what is the utility value of, are they called Ocean? What are they called, the coins?
Ocean tokens, yeah.
Ocean tokens, yeah. Sweet, yep. That it sounds like it's a medium of exchange token for this full data ecosystem, both for buying data, buying compute, buying data cleaning. Is that kind of a simplified way to talk about the utility value?
That's part of it, but it's not just a medium of exchange, because basically when people are staking on the data sets themselves, on the future popularity, then it is basically storing those tokens as this sort of lock-in of value into the network, right?
Yep.
So that is also sort of a proxy of the overall value of the network. So overall, there's a few different factors at play here. I should mention some of my colleagues actually went through Chris Bernanski's model and actually developed a whole model around the value of these tokens, and the numbers came out very cool. And we actually reviewed with Chris and stuff too. And it was just very nice to see, right? Sort of some of that the value, if you will, right, is the velocity of the tokens times the average transaction value and stuff, right? Sorry, yeah, and with Ocean, you can apply this sort of modeling technique to it and arrive at interesting numbers, right?
Cool. Yeah. So, and I think you're right there to say that it is both a medium exchange token and it's a more traditional, or not, I don't know, more traditional. The other big thing that people are doing in the space these days is these like bonding / staking tokens, whether it's staking for governance or staking to kind of hold the network. Let's think something like proof of stake, or something like bonding and live peer. So it's and you're doing it in a kind of curated market way. So kind of adding an additional layer on top of that. So I guess one final note before we transition over to token-curated registries here is that when Trent and I were talking about this kind of curve of I get in first, Trent gets in second, someone else gets in third, that's called a bonding curve within curation markets, is like determining what that bonding curve looks like. So just wanted to put those words out there. Okay, so now so I get the concept that you're using this new cryptoeconomic primitive, curation markets, in order to essentially do some kind of essentially staking on data as a way to kind of show, hey, this is the sweetest data to the world. So how do you use token-curated registries, which is essentially a decentralized way to make a list? What's on that registry?
Yeah, so overall, the very, very heart of Ocean is, this proofing times the curation market staking, right? And then kind of everything else around is kind of ancillary to address various attack vectors and other issues, right? So one of the issues is for the actors in this ecosystem, there's quite a few places where potential attack vectors, and one of them is we want to have some sort of proxy on identity, some sort of way to keep one person to know who one person is, roughly speaking, but we don't want to, if we can avoid it, we want to avoid things like KYC or anything like that, right? Because it is a public network, right? And so, and the reason we want this is when we're doing things like block rewards, a disaster scenario in our case, how we see things, we don't want one data set to be so massively powerful that, it's getting downloaded 10,000 times a day and then everyone just bets on that because it's the obvious win, right? So instead, we don't give a reward proportional to the amount of downloads directly. It's actually the log of the downloads. Same thing for the stake. We don't give a reward proportional to the stake itself. We give a reward proportional to the log of the stake. And this is actually a very common tactic in the world of AI, where you actually use a log rather than the direct value, because it focuses on the orders of magnitude rather than the actual values. And that in turn gives a lot more diversity. So in a sense, it stretches out the distribution to be much fatter tails. So instead of just one or a handful of data sets being sort of curated on, you're going to have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of data sets being curated on. And the other thing that's related, that's sort of on the download side. And then when the log on the staking side, what this does is it removes sort of inordinate gains to the token whales, right? So if they really want to leverage all their token holdings, they're actually going to have to bet on a lot more data sets, right? But by doing that, then you need to actually have decent identity, right? Because otherwise they're just going to game the system, and still not a perfect solution. But if you say, okay, have this token-curated registry for each actor, where, to get in, they basically, they can only get in once. If you seed with a good set, et cetera, then they can only get in once rather than 10 times or 100 times or whatever, right? And play different games. So that's kind of the motivation. There's a few other attack vectors too, where you want to have a decent proxy and identity. And this is sort of a nice way of doing it, where it's not forcing some sort of other mandated identity, right? Like government mandated, et cetera.
Got it. Yeah, I think that in token-curated registries can be seen as just a way in general. Token-curated registries and like other reputation systems and claim systems are all on kind of or attestation systems are on kind of, they're all solving a similar problem, which is like, hey, here's someone in the network. How do we know what their reputation is, or how do we know that it's a single person and not multiple people? So it sounds like, yeah, you're using a TCR, a token-curated registry, to say, hey, if I'm Reese and I'm trying to like dodge the log side of the gains and make a bunch of different Reeses, that it might be difficult for me to do that because there's a token curated registry which says, hey, this Reese 12 over here looks kind of similar to Reese 1, and we should not allow him into the registry of whitelisted data providers. Is that right? Exactly.
Yeah, and we were asking ourselves too, should we have just a whitelist of, they're either malicious or they're not, or do we want to have reputation and stuff? And we looked at a variety of reputation systems and whatnot too. But one question we continually ask ourselves is, what's the simplest thing that could possibly work, right? And so we were looking at, for example, what if we had nothing but, say, a TCR, a registry on just the data, and don't even have it for identity or anything? But then, we have this list of questions we're trying to ask, like how well does it handle price data and referrals and spam prevention? How well does it do for the free data, the commons data? And other questions, is there greater marginal benefit to the owners of the tokens versus people who are just hodling, right? And so as we were exploring various designs of, TCR, for identity, should we have nothing? Should we have TCR? Should we have a heavier identity system from anything from, say, Civic style or UPort style up to like KYC from banks up to, say, like Estonia e-residency, right? And then reputation systems on top, right? Whether it's like a star rating system or something. And then same thing with the data, right? And where you can have everything from, okay, this is just not spam versus yes, it is with a TCR or something, to a reputation system in the form of a curation market or a more standard one like with stars or something else, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we explored many combinations of these and against these checklists of how well is it solving this problem, this problem, this problem? So 7 or 8 key questions and another, checklist of another 100 questions, including a whole bunch of attack vectors, right? And the design that we came up with actually addresses the questions very well with sort of the simplest thing that could possibly work, right? And that's why we ended up at just this level of TCR, the registry for the actors, and just the level of the curation market for the data. Not heavier, not later, just that level.
Just right. That makes sense. So I guess maybe kind of transitioning into the second kind of half of this episode here. This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the world's leading trustless digital asset exchange. Quickly swap between dozens of cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Ether, Dash, Bitcoin Cash, Augur, Golem, and many more. And this is not your typical crypto exchange. You don't need to create an account or share your personal information, and your funds are never stored on Shapeshift. This means that your hard-earned digital wealth is never up for grabs by hackers or other malicious actors. To get started, visit Shapeshift.io, choose the tokens you'd like to swap, input your receiving address, and send your funds. It's that easy. Pretty good understanding of there's BigChainDB and there's Ocean protocol, which is this underlying data substrate, and it allows for that underlying data substrate by being a protocol for these data marketplaces, and there are these various incentive games, both curation markets for staking around the quality of data and kind of bonding to it, and then also TCRs to make sure you're doing kind of reputation identity well. That all kind of makes sense, but like one question that I have is, and the macro goal here is to make it the case that, or one of the macro goals, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you have these, we're in this data siloed world where Google and Amazon and Facebook have these massive data silos, and they're in these arms races to get more and more data and to kind of control it all themselves, and it's difficult for other people to get into the ecosystem or whatever. How, would it ever be the case in the future that, how can we get someone like Google or Facebook, getting their data onto these data marketplaces? Is that like a goal of your guys's? And how does this relate to some of your concepts with things like tokenizing the enterprise?
Yeah, so I would say, actually, that's a great question, the tokenized part too. I'll get to that in a bit, but overall, the data silos thing is exactly why we're doing this, right? And perhaps I will elaborate because it's really, really important.
Yep.
So, and I'd like to give a story that actually it happened about just a month ago. This reporter from National Geographic, Rachel Bale, she was writing a story in Google Docs. She's a wildlife crime reporter. And when she was writing the story, she was just typing, writing the story. And then suddenly her Google Docs froze. And she had a pop-up from Google, and it said, hey, you violated terms of service. We're locking you out. We're freezing you out. And she's like, what is going on? So she tweeted about it. And a bunch of other people replied to her saying, hey, me too. This happened to me too. And so a bunch of people are like, what's going on? A day later, Google gave a press release saying, hey, sorry about that. We had a glitch in our system. We pushed some code where it was falsely locking people out of the system because it had a false classification on violating terms of service. So basically, Google was running a classifier, or is running a classifier, on whether you're typing something that might violate the terms of service, which apparently relates to they didn't say it, but it's crime of some form and stuff, right? And wildlife crime apparently wasn't okay, but that was the glitch. So Rachel got back in, and then kind of the hubbub died down briefly. But if you think about it, it's super scary. Google did not stop scanning your documents, ready to shut you out in a heartbeat, in an instant. They just fixed their glitch on cutting out reports of wildlife crime. But if I'm, writing a high school essay on Al Qaeda, then I could get shut out. Or think about democracy, right? Part of the main point of having a democratic society is where you can write about concerns of your leaders, of your government, and publish on it. Publish on Medium, publish in newspapers, etc. Publish on blogs, other blogs. And also, use digital tools of the world to organize a group of people to protest and about the government's actions, etc. But imagine you start writing about this, and Google's algorithms automatically detect you, and suddenly you are cut out, right? You don't only lose your own digital sovereignty, it's actually a risk to democracy and freedom itself, right? And to me, this is so scary, and makes me frankly angry, right? And it's not just Google, right? The Snowden revelations of 5 years ago, when those happened, Google apparently had been giving data to the government since 2012, but Microsoft had been doing it since 2007. And it's not just those two; it's Facebook and Amazon and so on, right? So all of these guys, they have these giant data silos. They control our digital lives. They have discovered that thanks to AI, actually, they know how to take all these giant data silos and mine that data very well and make money by selling more ads, and this sort of this data flywheel effect. And so they are totally incentivized to keep these silos and keep everyone else out, right? So they say they're AI companies, but really that's a head fake. They're really data companies, and they are going to fight and fight and fight to keep those silos because that's where they make their money from. And this is dangerous to society, as I've described. Now, in Ocean, what drives us is, we're not trying to attack this head on. That is, naive. But instead, we've asked ourselves the question, how do we get momentum in this? And the answer is, these companies that have both large data sets and AI algorithms are super rare. It's really just a handful, Google, Facebook, et cetera, of the world. Most large enterprises have tons of data, and they don't have the ability to extract value from it with AI. Why? Because all the AI researchers that they're trying to hire are off doing their own startups because they think that they can get more money that way. I did AI for 20 years. I get this. These are, I talk to my friends about this. And on the flip side, you've got these AI startups that they're trying to start up, but they're actually struggling in many cases because in order to get value from their AI models, they need reams and reams of data, right? So to them, the more data they can get, the better. And they're just willing to if they could have 1,000x more data, they will take it. Their models will just swallow it, right? So what we're doing is we're working with the folks that have tons of data sets. These are the large enterprises, as well as NGOs throughout the world. We're working with XPRIZE, which is actually in turn working with hundreds of NGOs throughout Africa, et cetera, for data sets, to gather data sets, et cetera. And on the flip side, the demand side is about the AI researchers and really engaging with that community, that I've known since the late 90s because I've been doing AI for a long time. And really connecting those, right? So connecting the data halves with the AI halves. And that's kind of the first cut, and getting strong that way in Ocean. And then what we see is that over time, people are going to get used to this idea that they have a lot more control and sovereignty over their data. And it gives them a whole lot more tools for new ways to rethink social networks, et cetera, right? It's really, really hard to there's 2 billion people using Facebook, is it monthly now? And, that's a very, very strong network. And, Facebook has done an incredible job, right? And I'm not sure, many people in Facebook itself, I'm sure, aren't very happy about the extreme power that they have, right? But there are means to get at it, to address this for society. And that is, to get strong in sort of a parallel universe that isn't dependent on trying to take down Facebook. And then basically having the substrate for various people to help basically address Facebook, either via direct competitors to Facebook that do data better, or towards your initial hint, the tokenize the enterprise part, right? And maybe we can talk about that, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, exactly. Okay, sweet. So, the question that I asked was too wide-reaching. So, that makes sense. So I guess one thing to double check here, I agree that whenever there's centralization of power, it just seems to often have negative ramifications from both what the people do at that power perspective, from fragility perspective in terms of what happens to it, from a privacy perspective. How much are you guys also thinking about how much in your mind is the kind of artificial general intelligence, like AGI, making sure that there's a friendly AGI? Is that in your guys' mind as well, or is that kind of a further down the road thing?
So overall, spending time in the world of AI, I know that well. And, the folks at SingularityNet, Ben, their friend, I help advise them and so on, right? Help them with their token design and stuff. They too are using curation markets, which is cool. So, and Simon's happy with that. So overall, AGI, I think about, in the next few years, it's not really an issue. Farther along, certainly, I see that the technology will probably come sooner than people think, and we should be worried. I don't have a tenure to protect, so or a reputation. A 100-year-old institution that fires me if I say something that affects their long term. So I don't care, and I'm saying I am worried about that. Mm-hmm. I think there's more near-term things that I'm even more worried about. Like AI DAOs. They're incredibly interesting. This idea that you can have, think like a DAO running on Ethereum, running around, but it actually has its own AI decision-making abilities.
Yep.
And it could be generating art and our CryptoKitties these days, I guess, and making millions perhaps, because it can do it all automatically and sell more, sell more. And but it doesn't have to be something so mundane either. It could be, for example, mining code from GitHub and or generating its own code with like genetic programming, which I did for several years. Yeah. Generating its own code and doing whatever gives it value, right? It could be very open-ended, and I'm very worried about that because overall, we might find ourselves giving more and more of our resources to AIs simply for convenience. Yeah. Instead of self-driving cars, it could be self-driving, self-owning cars. Mm-hmm. So that this could be a whole network of all the cars out there that's sort of like Nature 2.0, where they're self-driving, self-owning. And same thing with trucks and the power grid and even the utilities around us, right? And so there's a positive and negative way to frame it. The negative way is, oh man, as humans, we give all of our power to these machines, these DAOs that are with AI decision-making abilities, and that could mean we kind of like accidentally fully give up control. The positive way of thinking about it is that there's Nature 1.0 with the soil and the trees and the wind and the earth and the fire and all this, and it's sort of this cradle for humanity. But why can't we extend that cradle for humanity with silicon and steel, right? With these self-driving cars, et cetera, towards sort of a new age of abundance, right? And the answer will probably lie somewhere in between, as it usually does, right? But we do need to talk about AI DAOs more broadly in society, right? It's as powerful as the bomb or as CRISPR. It's just there isn't a lot of awareness yet, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, AI DAOs are, it's essentially just any kind of objective function with capital and kind of like voting power behind it that just kind of goes and does whatever its objective function wants to do, and we got to make sure that those objective functions are well-designed ones. I guess one thing to check in, you're talking about creating this kind of parallel universe, and creating this big community of the AI researchers and the data people and what have you. Is there are you using some of these concepts around like have you heard of like spiral dynamics or teal, which are these like bottom up organic ways to kind of build movements? Are you kind of pulling from those things, or have you heard about those concepts?
A little bit, maybe not as much as we could be. Okay. There's a lot of concepts in various ways. Because I spend a lot of time in the world of evolution and computation, we think about that a lot, about, bottom-up emergent complexity, where you might have a very simple rule set or a few rule sets, but then you have very complex dynamics that emerge on top, right? And and we see that with Bitcoin, right? It's got a very simple objective function, just maximize the hash rate. And you think about the crazy ecosystem that has emerged on top, right? Or from the AI world, things like a simple cellular automata, where you just have a very, very simple rule function, but you can have very complicated patterns, or chaotic systems, right? Even a chaotic system of one variable, just very, very simple function can have really, really complex dynamics. So we think about those. And, there's many fields that we try to draw on, right? And look at, obviously there's a lot from economics. And I think you mentioned mechanism design already. And it's interesting, if you drill down for mechanism design, one drill down is that one framing is if you assume that people are telling the truth, sort of the Schelling point of truth, all this, then that sort of proves a bunch of other stuff. And you can drill down a bit more, and it ends up actually where you're at objective functions, right? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the link to, thinking of this stuff as designing evolutionary algorithms, right? So when we're designing the tokenized ecosystems, because I've designed so many evolutionary algorithms in my career for various things, creative circuit design, function evolution, all this, then I think about it this way. And then it's like, okay, there's an objective function you're trying to minimize or maximize. You've got some constraints. You've got, in the case of there's this parallel between evolution algorithms and tokens in general, right? You've got the block rewards that happen, every 10 minutes in Bitcoin. In the case of evolutionary algorithms, you've got a generational update. And then the key thing is you've got these agents running around in both cases that you can't really control. In the case of evolutionary algorithms, they're individuals. They mutate, they cross over, they do whatever. And all you can do is evaluate them. Every generation, it's like, did you do well? Great, you get to live. If you didn't, you die, right? Or maybe you let them live and have babies and change some more, right? In token design, it's similar. These agents, they run around, agents as in people doing mining, etc. And if they do well, then, on average, they get more tokens, rewards. And sometimes also, if they act badly, they get their stake slashed, right? So there's such similar phenomenon in many, many ways that you can leverage the ideas from evolutionary algorithm design for token design. And, it continually surprises me how many insights that we're getting that way.
Nice.
And I think it'll continue. And I look forward to even strengthening the link between that and sort of the higher level theories of mechanism design.
Got it. Yeah, I haven't personally made that connection yet between mechanism design and then drilling down deeper layers there, but I definitely love both. I mean, evolutionary algorithm are great, and generative kind of complex systems is a great field as well. So I guess kind of transitioning to something that we want to talk about, which is this tokenizing the enterprise. And I guess let's take a bit on tokenizing the enterprise, because for me, this is kind of the optimal future reality where you have something like the Facebooks and the Google. Like right now, you have Facebook, where you have these misaligned incentives where Facebook just wants to addict you for more and more time, and the people who are using it and the advertisers just want to put things that are clickable because they're trying to maximize their clicks and their eventual ROI and what have you. And I feel like the people who are on the other side, the users, it would be nice if there was more meditation apps or whatever through Facebook, or if, it wasn't so much outrage or filter bubbles that were pushed into my Facebook feed. So when I imagine the future, it's this awesome future where Facebook is kind of a platform co-op where it is both the ownership is, decentralized and distributed, and the governance is distributed and decentralized. And you have a bunch of different UX layers that can be put on top of this underlying data substrate. That's kind of this future awesome maybe world of tokenizing the enterprise. Do you see, I guess, where do you see kind of Ocean protocol fitting into that? And or how do you see tokenizing the enterprise things starting to happen either with Ocean protocol or in the blockchain space more generally?
Sure, yeah. So, well, in general, obviously, yeah, I'm clearly a big fan of the idea of tokenizing the enterprise. I've written about it and so on. And maybe for your audience to just flesh out the Facebook example, right?
Yep.
So you hit the nail on the head. The incentives are not aligned, right? You've got the users where they just want to do stuff, connect with their friends, and so on, but they don't necessarily want to give up their privacy, especially going to the future. Whereas with Facebook, they actually want to maximize how much information they want to extract from you. So there's always this classic tension of privacy versus not, right? And Facebook is trying to train its users away from wanting to be private about their data. So it's this tension, and we see it in other places too, right? With Visa, it's a classic example. Even the founder himself of Visa, he mentioned this error they made. The banks are happy about Visa, and the end user customers are generally happy, but the mom and pop merchants are not, because they're not part of the overall ecosystem. They don't get the financial rewards, and that's where they're getting charged 5%, 7%, typically fees by Visa, because their interests are not aligned with that of Visa, right? So the founder, Dee Hock, he actually talks about this and wished that they had found a way to incorporate that. So interests misaligned, and of course, we're on the blockchain space, so we realize that blockchains are a really great tool to align interests. And how do you align interests? Well, you get everyone to be holding tokens, and then everyone is incentivized for the value of the tokens to rise. That's a simple mechanism, right? The challenge is, you want to get the tokens into the hands of the various stakeholders. So for the case of Facebook, what does this look like? How do you take Facebook from its sort of centralized approach right now to sort of this glorious decentralized future? And the key idea is you want the existing shareholders to own tokens, and you want the community, the users, to hold tokens. How? One possible recipe is you take all the existing shares and you convert them to tokens, and then living on a blockchain. And at the same time, you print another 2x, another 100% more tokens, and distribute those to all the users based on their usage of Facebook over the last lifetime of Facebook, right, about 15 years. And so now you have a whole bunch of tokens spread throughout the existing shareholders and the new users. And a pretty good argument can be made that now, because Facebook's no longer having misaligned incentives, everyone is pointing in the same direction to raise the value of the tokens, then the overall value of the Facebook token could go up in comparison to simply if it was held by shareholders before, because the interests of the shareholders are now aligned with the interests of the users, right? And so if it goes up by at least 2x, then it pays for itself, right? If it goes up by 10x, then everyone's really happy, right? If it goes down a bit, so be it. It's an experiment. And so this to me is the ideal way. Now, to your question of how might Ocean relate to this, or BigChain, a key prerequisite to doing this, if you're going to have sort of Facebook as sort of a ultimately it could be just tokens like that, as the first cut, just tokens replacing shares. But really, you want to have utility value, right? So you kind of want to turn all the different Facebook services into fat protocols, if you will, right? Yep. But to do that, then you need to have the compute and the data tokenize itself, right? So a prerequisite to all of this is to sort of API-ize every sort of internal service, and then decentralize. And so where Ocean and BigChain play in is basically playing key roles in case of Ocean, it's on the tokenizing the data, and in BigChain, it's on the databases below for just decentralized, whether it's that data is made available via Ocean or otherwise, it's just actually this sort of, lower in the stack of storing the structured metadata, right? So that's how they play a role. And you might think, oh, this is a big stretch, right? And the thing is, we're already seeing signs of this. So with medium-sized companies, so a small to medium-sized company that did it was Numerai, and they've been going down this path where they started out centralized, and bit by bit they're going more and more decentralized. In this case, they're a crypto-style hedge fund. Just initially, they were just a hedge fund that had a crowd of data scientists, 10,000 data scientists making predictions with models, and then they would get paid out, and Numerai would be the middleman in all of it. But then the challenge there was, if I'm a data scientist A and you're data scientist B, you might not tell me about Numerai, because if I'm really good and you're not as good, then why would you tell me? Because I might take more earnings than you, and it's a zero-sum game. But if we all have Numerai tokens, Numeraire to be precise, then you'll tell me, because if I join and actually help do a better job in prediction, everyone wins, right? So Numerai did that, and they went through a series of steps to decentralize more and more and more. And that's a very great example. Kik is another one, a messaging service that has been going through a process of tokenization as well. If you're a large company, you don't need to tokenize the whole thing at once, right? Amazon famously converted themselves into basically a series. They APIs themselves, right? Yep. So within Amazon, they're all APIs. So what they could do is, with even just a single one of their services that they run even internally, they could try a tokenized version and then see if that works. And if that works, they do it to another service, and then another, and then another, and then give it 1 year, 5 years, and suddenly they, they're fully decentralized, right? And that could be very cool, because what's happened is you have melted these giant companies, these sort of octopus or octopi, into the community, right? So, melting the enterprise into the community. And I see it as a really exciting outcome, just like you. And sort of a very quick thing, there's this classic innovator's dilemma challenge of, if you're a big enterprise, how do you react to changes from, bottom-up people, right? Mm-hmm. And if you don't react quickly enough, then you're Kodak, losing out to digital cameras, and you just die. And the classic solution is simply to create a spin-off, fund that a bit, and then as it gets big to $1 billion business or bigger, then you buy it back. But here's another solution that actually goes to the heart of the problem directly, right? And to me, that's very exciting, sort of a new solution to innovator's dilemma. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that I was going to reference the Amazon business units as well, and the API-izing. I think that the key thing that we'll see here is, with something like Numerai, it's, by using Numeraire, we're able to align those incentives. And hopefully we'll be able to see with Kik or with Props and You now or whatever, that these companies have said, oh man, this is interesting. Various stakeholders within our kind of business model haven't been aligned. And if they are aligned, then there's more value for everyone. And so that's got to be the key kind of hypothesis that we need to prove to these bigger companies, to say, hey, this is actually better for everyone if you align incentives. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. And I also agree with you that, as you APIize, then those APIs turn into various things that the blockchain world has been building, like Ocean, like BigChain. Okay, so, and kind of to wrap up here, let's talk about this final kind of article that you wrote recently and some of these things that you've been talking about around this essentially a kind of a staged map that thinks about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and this goal for us as a society right now where there's these converging exponential trends and we're trying to transition to this world of abundance that you talked about and the nature 2.0 with all the silicon around us. So could you kind of describe what, how you think about that in terms of this like map and especially what would be some of the first things to do on this map?
Sure. So thank you for your interest in this. I find it fun, and maybe for the audience, a first cut way to sort of approach this is, what's the biggest idea you could possibly dream, right? And not just sort of you as your idea, but like for humanity. What's the grandest goal we could go for humanity as a civilization, right? Or set of goals, right? Because maybe everyone has their own goal, just like own goals in life, right? So for each person, what might that be, right? And there's some things we know we don't want. There's some things we know we do want. There's things in the near term. There's things in the medium term and the longer term. And overall, it's a journey, right? Civilization's a journey, not a destination. And some of these longer term things to me are things like not being stuck on one planet or even two, but actually exploring the cosmos. And not only exploring it, but why not reshaping it, right, towards these long-term futures of things like Dyson spheres and stuff, right? This is exciting possible futures that are, a long ways out, but why not think about them and then ask yourselves, okay, if these are the long-term futures, what are the steps to get there, right? And why not map these out, right? Step 1 to step 2 to step 3 and so on, right? And it's interesting, there hasn't been a lot of explicit discussion about this explicit mapping. Instead, it's in the heads of a lot of, super nerds or technologists. Myself and friends have sat down, drawing out maps over beers and stuff like this for fun for many years, actually. And there's other sort of, lots of initiatives around society and stuff in various ways, right? Things like you've got the X Prize or the Gates Foundation or the UN. UN has its 17 goals to sort of like make a better civilization, right? Or the X Prize is their various prizes that they think will help drive civilization together one more step, initially from, getting into space cheaply twice in a row to the Lunar X Prize to AI prizes and so on. And the Gates Foundation for things like, curing malaria or, toilets that don't use water, etc. And these are all really wonderful, wonderful goals, right? But every single one of those goals is sort of like just one step out, right? It's not 2 steps, it's not 3 steps. And, many people talk about 2 steps or 3 steps and dream about them and write about them. But it's hard to, like, what if we can link, if we do step 1 and then it will unlock the ability to do step 2 and then step 3. Or maybe we need to do step 1 and 2 and 3 and then we can do step 4, right? So, and there's lots of examples in various things, right? For example, okay, if we want to get to Mars, well, we need to have, not just get to Mars, but get to Mars where we can actually create a civilization. Well, then we need to have really cheap rockets into space. Well, how do we get really cheap rockets into space? We need to have reusable rockets. Okay, great. And then also, what about when we're on Mars? What are the things we need? Or if we want, towards this idea of abundance and so on, or this risk of AI taking all the jobs, right? There's this worry that AI takes all the jobs before we figure out, new jobs. And it's not only a worry, I think it's a very big risk, right? 3 million jobs in America will be lost to trucking alone when trucking goes autonomous. And there's already autonomous trucks in production, right, that are driving on the roads. So, and that will not just take the trucking jobs, it will also decimate middle America with the motels and hotels and 7-Elevens and so on, right? So one solution to that, for example, is UBI, Universal Basic Income. And of course, there's naysayers on that, that's fine. There's actually been a lot of experiments and the data on that is very promising, right? Blockchain actually solves the distribution problem of UBI, right? And there's, various related efforts out there that help for that. But a simple way to think about it is, imagine there's a UBI chain running. You sign up for it, prove that you're your own identity, and then anytime new money flows into the chain, you get your cut. Everyone gets an equal cut. So, as time goes on, more and more people sign up. So you've solved the distribution problem, but what about the supply problem, right? How do you solve that? How do you get money into that? And there's various ideas to that. But if you manage to crack UBI, then you actually de-risk the problem of AI taking all the jobs. And if AI takes jobs, even with 10% of jobs very aggressively, then we could be having, seeing revolts, Luddite-style revolutions and stuff, right? So it's really important to try to address these. But then, going farther out, Yeah, I'll just give one more final example of this. So right now we're seeing, early VR, right? And we're seeing early AR too. But, the VR isn't quite there yet. It's expensive. It hasn't quite hit mainstream. There's lots of good attempts. It's still probably got 2 or 3 years worth of Moore's law, of this improvements in performance of the chips, the sort of battery power versus the screen resolution, et cetera, before we get something that's really good. And, the form factors need to get solved. And only once we get that really good for VR can we do a good job in AR, because that has much more severe power constraints. So sort of VR will lead to AR. And then once we have AR, then we can start to, like the first cut AR, which might be just simple overlays, like very lightweight head-up display type things on our glasses or contact lenses. But then beyond that, what about AR that's fully repainting reality? And that's a possibility. It just will take that much more compute power, et cetera, right? And getting the form factor right, et cetera. And then you can keep going to things beyond that. So these are all different steps. And all these things interrelate, everything from solving malaria to AI and UBI and going to Mars and all of these. There's a lot of technologies that are general purpose technologies that help each of these, like AI, blockchain, and these, right? But there are also risks. So anyway, overall, imagine if this, I described a cluster of these things with sort of linkages, a few linkages between, but imagine if there was a map out there that just was out there that people could see. And not only see, they could actually contribute to it, and they could propose their own ideas. And maybe it has, 30 nodes initially with a few steps in between, as sort of this DAG of civilization. Not unlike you play in the video game Civilization as a technology tree. But here's the thing: imagine that you can add to it. You can suggest whatever you want and add to it and curate it. And the key thing is, imagine if you can have a Bitcoin address or an Ethereum address or whatever attached to each of these nodes that people propose. And so if you like an idea, you can actually fund it. You can put, $100 or $100 million into any given node. And once it crosses some sort of threshold, something sparks, right? Maybe there becomes an X prize for it, where say a $10 million X prize to solve a particular goal X, right? Of solving VR with certain latency, or solving, malaria in some better way. Just like we've seen with things like Gates Foundation and X Prize, but generalized to things not just one step ahead, but 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead, and curated by the crowd itself, right? And so basically, there's billions of dollars that the blockchain ecosystem has generated in value. So rather than those billions of dollars to doing ads a little bit better, which is actually cool still, but why not civilization level stuff, right? And amazingly, we can see where things like a file system for the planet, or a database for the planet, or a data substrate for the planet, all of these things actually do fit in, right? So even when trying to select different crypto projects that are ICOing and whatnot, right? Is it on the map, right? So overall, I call this thing the map. Is it on the map? Is it actually potentially helping humanity to drive humanity forward in some way? And when I say drive forward, once again, I mean that in the sense of whatever you want. But there's a framing, sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is just for individuals, where the lowest level is barely getting by, barely feeding your family, to the very top level, which is full-on self-actualization, Ben Franklin style, whatever. But not just for barely getting by as individuals, to the self-actualization of individuals, not just that, but for society itself, right? What does it mean for society itself to self-actualize, to be like Ben Franklin? And I see that this map is potentially a way to start getting there, right? So once again, it's a civilization DAG with crypto addresses attached to fund these ideas. And that is, the ideas come from the crowd. The money comes to the crowd. It's all curated by the crowd. And it basically gives us all a context towards the sort of society level stuff that we're building, not just for the next 1 year, but the next 5 years, 10 years, 10,000 years.
Yeah, I love it. And it's pretty hilarious how aligned that is with some of this other commons work that I'm doing these days around essentially, and it's all about this leveraging the crowd and some of this generative complexity things that we were talking about, where it's like, hey, we are essentially creating these various bounties / Patreon / stake trees around these given goals and impact outcomes, and the map itself is curated by the crowd, and the amount of money that's being put towards things is curated by the crowd, and then one thing that I would say is that from the DAG mindset, and a DAG is a distributed acrylic or acyclic graph rather, and it's like a from this to that, then whatever. I think my instinct, and I'll share this in a bit, is that that some of these systems and some of these essentially nodes in that map that you're talking about need to be co-evolved at the same time in a simultaneous fashion, and that's kind of necessary for the system itself to go forward. With that, I think it's time for us to end today. So Trent, thank you so much for coming on, both talking about what you guys are doing at Ocean and Big Chain, how that relates to tokenizing the enterprise, and then also how it might relate to the map.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was great. And for those of you who are listening, if you want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/RieslandMark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Also, I'd love feedback on this one because this was an hour and 15 minutes. And usually we do like 30 or 45. So we'd love your feedback there. Thanks so much, everybody, and goodbye.